Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. We are in the final segment of today's show, and it should be a good one. We are going to conclude today's show with another QB player profile of a guy who played for that team right there, but now is entering a very intriguing part of his NFL career as he goes to a new home in Pittsburgh that he might feel best represents his opportunity to not fade away and fall by the wayside in Russell Wilson. Like I said, moving from Denver to Pittsburgh, Russell Wilson is certainly looking for that kind of consistency that he found for the first couple of years in Seattle. And so, just looking at him, I thought would be very interesting, especially in comparison to a guy like Joe Burrow, who, is also in a weird point of his career where he can be just like a Russell Wilson was early in his career as one of the better quarterbacks in the NFL. But let's just look at Russell Wilson's fantasy stats and what makes him unappealing and potentially somewhat appealing in a new home. In his career, he's accumulated 3,536.9 fantasy points. His best season was in 2019, kind of in that nice little 3-year period where Seattle had a nice offense with 359.78 fantasy points. And fantasy odds are projecting him to have a very interesting season. His first in Pittsburgh, 2,877 yards, 16 TDs, 9 interceptions, 283 rushing yards, 3 touchdowns for a total of 218.2 fantasy points. Now, last year in Denver, his last, he didn't necessarily have as bad a season as people think, and actually had moments where he looked like the same Russell Wilson we had grown to expect from him in Seattle. And so there's definitely a lot not to like about him, but he's still proven that he's in that mid-range of fantasy QBs. He was 14th among all QBs in total fantasy points, 16th in points per game. He had the third best completion rate of his career, third in the league in passing touchdowns rate. But in terms of how he did it, that's where he's called into question. Much unlike what we saw from him in Seattle, where he trusted his deep ball, one of the better deep balls in the NFL in his tenure with Seattle. With Denver, that ultimately changed. 79th in intended air yards per attempt, 37 in caught air yards per attempt. But another reason to also like him is he still maintained his rushing ability, as he was 7th among QBs in rush yards and 5th in carries. So you can see there are a lot of different dichotomies to dissecting Russell Wilson. There are some good attributes, and there are some not so good attributes. But let's just look at him as he enters a new part of his career with the Pittsburgh Steelers, where is a QB room where he might not even win the starting job, although he's expected to over Justin Fields. And so, looking at Russell Wilson, I certainly believe there's merit in him being someone in the middle range he might take a flyer on, but I can't go so far as to say I would start him at the QB position for more than, say, 5 games, because Pittsburgh is an unknown kind of realm for him. They lost a lot of receiver depth. Their best kind of receiving prospect right now might just be Pat Freiermuth. They lost Deontay Johnson. They lost Chase Claypool. And there really doesn't have that same complexion as some Steelers teams in the past, where you kind of had receivers who had a striking profile that could lead the team. And so Russell Wilson kind of goes into this with somewhat of a warped mindset where he knows he can still be that level of consistency we saw last year, but he's going to have to do it largely with an unappealing group. And so, while I do believe those fantasy stats could happen, I don't necessarily believe he's going to have as good a season as people think. And here's why. In the latter years of his career in Seattle, the caveat that a lot of people had was Russell's kind of shift from someone who was willing to play within the system of the team to a more business-oriented approach where he became more about wanting to be the center of attention for this offense. He wanted to be high profile. And for large swaths of his career in Seattle, especially in the final years, Pete Carroll was willing to stroke that side of his ego. And he really fanned the flames for that exit because of the fact that when I view Russell Wilson, it's not one thing that I see on the field that makes me worry and gives me pause about him, but it's kind of how he commands himself off the field, especially now, where he is someone who relies on his intelligence for getting him to where he was. And if he feels his intelligence is compromised, like we saw early in his career in Denver with Sean Payton, I feel like that's where he loses confidence in himself. And so I don't necessarily think that the stats on paper are what worries me about Russell Wilson, because there are going to be some areas where he feels more comfortable in. We saw it with his rushing ability in Seattle. We saw it as he transitioned to a more deep ball thrower, protecting his body later in his Seattle career, and as we saw kind of in stretches in Denver as well, where he learned to shorten his game. But throughout that timeline, there's a through line there that represents way too much change for someone who now wants to focus on making himself more of a brand, more of a name in the NFL. I just don't think he's at that point in his career right now. And I think that moving to Pittsburgh, he's going to have to learn the hard way that playing within a system that is focused on a team identity now is not something he's going to necessarily like. I think his transition to Pittsburgh might be a bit more difficult than people assume. That being said, he still has Russell Wilson-like traits that made him such an attractive player in Seattle early on in his career. And so I think you're going to get a very piecemeal version of Russell Wilson where you're going to get this conglomeration of the young, unafraid Russell Wilson, who was just making a name for himself in Seattle, and more of the kind of business-oriented Russell Wilson as the season progresses and as he wants to gain more control of the offense than usually expected. And so, in my humble opinion, looking at why Russell Wilson might be a problem in fantasy is kind of a weird situation. It's a complicated bridge to cross here, because I admire the traits and attributes that Russell Wilson chose to focus on early in his career, but right now, especially as he gets up there in age, I think right now he should be more concerned with playing within a system, because that's what made him kind of a hallmark in Seattle, is because in his early career, no matter what you heard about the rumblings in the Seattle locker room about how he might not have been the best teammate and stuff of that nature, I still think he understood that it was a team narrative, and as his career went on, I think that kind of mindset waned and he became much more centered among himself and what he wanted rather than maybe what the organization wanted in Seattle. And now that could be the case again in Pittsburgh, a very team-identified squad that right now is in a period where they know they might not succeed, but still want someone who has a level head and can help a young, thin wide receiver room who doesn't have one big name succeed. And so I think that Russ will win the starting job. I don't think he has any worries there, but it's about what he does with it and how he adapts to a different kind of team again, much like one he was entering in Seattle, that really wants his help, but he just has to give in to that mindset again and be free. But that should just about do it for this edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Hope you liked today's show. We're going to have a lot of nice shows throughout the week as well. But be sure to like, follow, and subscribe to the show and the network as a whole. Consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud as a huge support to both me and my fellow podcasters and the network as a whole. So anything you leave is greatly appreciated. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in. I've been Christopher Shepard. We will be back tomorrow better than ever with a new edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Thank you guys. Happy Monday.